The problem we have is we have to hold our hands up and say, the governance of African countries is very poor. And we're not united. So the problem we have is the same problem we had in the 1950s that Kwame Nkrumah talked about in Africa Must Unite, when he wrote the book in the 1960s about basically why Africa should come together as a continental unity. And think about all the things that happened in Europe. Is basically, Nkrumah talked about all this in the 1950s and in the 1960s. We need a common currency. We need no borders. We need everybody having the same African passport. He said the military should be integrated to have one African military, because if you had one African military, it'd be very difficult to have a coup. In America, to have a coup is very difficult because you can't have a coup in California because the troops in California are not Californian troops, they're American troops. So they're first loyal to America, they're not loyal to California. If you have troops in Ghana, if you bribe the troops in Ghana or infiltrate them, they may topple the government in Ghana. But if the troops in Ghana are African troops, that's a bit more trouble. That's a problem, because you can't just topple the Ghanaian government because the troops there are not Ghanaians. So they're not angry necessarily with the government. They're not loyal to. They don't have an issue with the Ghanaian government specifically. So these are the reasons about integration. He talked about a common currency where the whole of Africa has the same currency and the same trade. Now, the problem with Africa is, for example, the Ivory Coast has cocoa. Ghana has cocoa. So the European Union goes to the Ivory Coast and plays them off against each other to get the cheapest cocoa price. Now, if Africa was unified, we could say there's only one price. This is the price you buy cocoa for, take it or leave it. We know chocolate markets around the world will collapse without our cocoa. And chocolate is the second product, is the secondary products that make all the profit. We don't make the profit because we're not making enough chocolate. The chocolate is predominantly made in Europe, but it's supplied by us. But if we control cocoa prices, so we said, right, no cocoa in Africa can be sold unless it's that price, because you can only buy it from one source, an African source. At the moment, you can go to Ghana and go to Ivory Coast and play them off and say, who wants our business? And you play them off against each other and say, who's going to give us the cheapest price? And you keep playing them off against each other. If they came together and said, no, this is what OPEC did. In 1970s, all the oil producing countries in the world came together and said, no more, and we're going to allow the West to control oil prices. We're going to come together, and they doubled oil prices overnight. In the 1970s, they said, right, we're going to double the price. And since then, they've controlled it, or had semi-control over it. And that's the difference. And in the African Union, that's what we as African people should be thinking about, lobbying and putting pressure on African Union to come together so they have a common economic policy. So when they negotiate with the European Union or negotiate with Britain, they negotiate as a bloc. So they get goods and things supplied as a bloc. So you can't buy diamonds from South Africa and then play them off against diamonds in Botswana, or, as I said, cocoa in Ivory Coast. You can't play us one against the other. If we had the whole of Africa as one economic trading bloc, they would have the same power that the European Union has, which is, if you want to trade with Europe, you have to come through the European Union. If you want to trade with Africa, you have to come through the African Union. And they have the same kind of principles and standards, but the African Union hasn't quite developed to the same way.